Continuing our reading in Abraham Hannibal and the Battle for the Throne by Francis Summers Cox, Chapter 22, For the Glory of Russia. Over the next 4 days, the whole huge body of the Russian army, all 42,000 men of it, was jumping with activity. The tents were struck, the wagons were loaded, and at last the cavalry and the foot soldiers made their way slowly up the east bank of the river to the ford 7 miles north, where Abraham had left his mare and waded across. That fateful day when some Russian sharpshooters had shot across the river and by chance wounded a king. No one ever found out for certain who had done it, though a good few people claimed to have been responsible. For 2 whole days the river was full of lines of men and horses, cannons and wagons, crossing over from the east to the west. And at last the 2 armies were on the same side of the river. This time they met no resistance. Slowly the Russians began to work their way down toward the Swedes. Peter's plan was to build a strong camp, or fort, about halfway between the ford and Poltava, a square of huge earth walls with a deep ditch at the front, open at the back where the steep river bank plunged down behind, so that no enemy army could possibly attack. Overnight the soldiers worked, and by morning the fort walls were up. Just as in St. Petersburg or Moscow, Peter wasn't just barking out commands, but sweated away with the men, leaping from one job to another, digging and heaving the earth himself, stamping and smoothing it down, helping to drag the heavy cannons up onto the walls, with Abraham energetically making sure that he wasn't left behind. No one's going to say I'm slacker than my czar. Meanwhile, Charles lay close to death, but in the end, like the tough fighter that he was, he pulled through. There was no chance, however, of him riding into battle or leading his own troops. As the Russian army was moving across the river, his mood and the mood of his soldiers grew gloomier and gloomier. Food supplies were low, and they were short of cannons, bullets, and dry gunpowder. On a steamy Saturday afternoon, as the midday heat was just beginning to wear off, 9 days after Abraham's nighttime visit to Poltava, Peter inspected his troops. 32,000 foot soldiers had their tents pitched inside the earth fort. 10,000 horsemen were positioned on the rough plains outside. "Get me the troops drawn up in parade formation," barked Peter to his generals. "Let me see what they look like, and I'd like to speak to as many as I can who can hear me at one time." Regiment after regiment of infantry lined up inside the fort, in their uniforms of bright red and green, in their shiny high black boots and 3-cornered hats, row upon row of muskets with sharp bayonets gleaming, propped on the soldiers' shoulders in perfectly matching diagonals. Flags waved only limply in the heavy dead air, but the bugles and flutes and drums made up for that with a fine din. Everyone was in a high spirit, and the musicians had the best chance to show it. Abraham was beside himself with pride and excitement as, along with the other drummer boys, he rat-a-tat-tatted his regiment into formation. The cavalry lined up on the outside of the fort, their steel breastplates and backplates, their drawn swords all glinting in the evening sunlight, the horses whinnying and fidgeting, as if they too knew that a great day was coming. Peter was mounted on his favorite brown stallion and slowly rode up and down the lines of infantry, then went out through the heavy rough door, and inspected the cavalry, nodding with satisfaction. At last he returned dismounted, climbed up onto the southwest corner of the fort wall, and looked out over the thousands of his soldiers. Abraham, as one of the drummers of Peter's own star regiment, was standing just below and could almost meet his eyes. There was absolute silence, broken only by the occasional snickering or stamping of an over-frisky horse on the plains outside. Abraham saw Peter lick his dry lips and heard him clear his throat. The Tsar raised his voice as loud as he could. "Soldiers, the hour has struck when the fate of the whole motherland lies in your hands. Either it will be the end of Russia, or she will be reborn a finer and stronger country. Do not think you are fighting for Peter. You are fighting for the survival and the glory of Russia. There was a tiny pause. Then a great roar broke out from thousands of throats, swelling back wave after wave across the ranks, as the men further back who hadn't heard a word picked up the cheer from the soldiers in front. On and on it went as the foot soldiers waved their hats above their heads, and the horsemen brandished their swords or fired pistols up into the air. The glory of Russia! The glory of Russia! The glory of Russia! And with a sudden great lurch of excitement in his stomach, Abraham thought, at last, this really is going to be it. And I did my part, getting us all moving across the river when we did. It was me who pushed this battle into happening. And that's the end of chapter 22.